It's a pleasure to welcome our next speaker. Carol Berman is professor of anthropology at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her area of expertise is in animal behavior with a specialty on primate social structure. Dr. Berman's current focus is on kinship, competition, and conflict management among macaques. She's been doing field research on rhesus macaques since 1974 on Cayo Santiago in Puerto Rico and in India. And more recently, she's worked on wild Tibetan macaques in China and is currently involved in projects on crested macaques in Indonesia. Dr. Berman's undergraduate training was in psychology at Brandeis University, and her doctorate work was completed at the University of Cambridge in UK. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Berman.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon. It's gratifying to see a group of people who respect the natural world and who are seeking ways for humans and non-humans to interact in a sustainable and mutually beneficial manner. My career has focused on primate social behavior, not conservation per se. But since 2000, I've also touched on the increasingly urgent topic of primate conservation. Nearly all primate species are threatened, and many are critically endangered. And as for most animals, there are good ecocentric and anthropocentric reasons to conserve primates. As an anthropologist, I see primates as intelligent and sentient creatures, as our closest relatives, and as variations on a theme that includes our own species, variation that we can use to reconstruct evolutionary pathways that got us to where we are. So my question for today is, how can we effectively promote primate conservation with tourism? Or perhaps more to the point, what practices should we avoid? To approach this question, I'd like to describe my research and complementary work of another research team headed by Dr. Megan Matheson, both on the impact of tourism in a population of Tibetan macaques on Mount Huangshan in China. My plan is first to place primate tourism in the context of community-based conservation, but also to discuss doubts that this is working quite as well as it should. Then I'll introduce the two research groups and their different but complementary approaches. Then I'll briefly describe the study site, the social group, and the way it's been managed over the years. And then finally, I'll describe the results. First, my study of long-term responses to tourism, focusing on infant mortality and aggression. And then Dr. Matheson's study of short-term behavioral responses. Now, very briefly, early efforts to conserve primates and other fauna typically came from outside habitat areas, and were not very successful, at least not on their own. They generally came from wealthy, industrialized societies like ours that don't compete for resources with non-human primates and don't depend on them for their economic livelihood. So they consisted primarily of convincing national governments to set aside large reserves where the animals would be protected from hunting, and where resources were off limits to both developers and to local impoverished local human groups. Now, not surprisingly, these restrictions have been very difficult to enforce. Encroachment and poaching have been increasingly huge problems, and many people have concluded that it is simply unreasonable to force local populations to shoulder the burden of conservation. So in the last few decades, conservationists have adopted a different model, community-based conservation. Here the idea is that conservation initiatives should involve the participation of local communities and should be organized in such a way as to yield not only sustainable habitat for local species, but also sustained economic returns for the local and wider economies. The assumption was that local people should be much more willing to cooperate in the protection of habitat and species if they gain economically. Indeed, they should initiate changes on their own to preserve their incomes. However, as many conservationists point out, this doesn't always happen, and pressures on the habitat can actually increase because people tend to move into the areas to take advantage of the increased opportunities there. In any case, one of the most common types of community-based conservation is wildlife tourism. Wildlife tourism operations have popped up all over the world and have been praised not only for their economic benefits, but also for their ability to educate both local populations and tourists about ecology, wildlife, and conservation. And primates seem to be a particularly effective species to draw in tourists. The best known and most successful example is the Mountain Gorilla Project, which brought Western tourists to Rwanda to view mountain gorillas and became the third highest contributor to the gross national product of that country until civil war broke out. Now, operations resumed there after the war, and similar operations that involve community-based participation and profit sharing are going strong in Uganda and to a lesser extent in the Congo. Now, having said that, in the last 15 years or so, some conservationists have begun to argue that wildlife tourism may also have a serious downside and that we simply haven't done enough to evaluate its effects on the species that it's supposed to benefit. The strongest case has been made for disease transmission. There is potential for disease transmission in both directions, and the risk is no doubt greater with non-human primates than with less closely related species. Researchers have attributed serious outbreaks of polio, TB, pneumonia, scabies, and measles in wild chimpanzees and gorillas to contact with humans, although not necessarily with tourists, with Ebola and AIDS going in the other direction. Another common detrimental effect of wildlife tourism is deterioration of habitat. Tourists often trample habitat, and of course, hotels and restaurants are built to accommodate them. Now, in addition to these problems, beginning in about 2000, there's been a steady trickle of reports of more subtle effects of tourism on the behavior of primates and other animals. Changes in the use of habitat, activity patterns, and social behavior. And these could have detrimental effects on fitness. One study in 2000 in particular got me into this research and made me realize just how much we have to learn. Stella de la Torre and her colleagues compared several behavioral and reproductive measures in several groups of pygmy marmosets in one area of Ecuador. Now, some of these groups were exposed to tourists and others were not. And they found that the groups exposed to tourists used the lower levels of the forest less than other groups, and the youngsters played less. And they characterized both of these effects as attempts by the pygmy marmosets to avoid exposure to humans. They also found suggestive but inconclusive evidence that these groups were not reproducing as well as undisturbed groups. But they were not able to definitively tie the reproductive problems to tourism or present data supporting any likely causal links between behavioral differences and fitness differences. So they left open the question of what exactly it was about tourism that led to avoidance and perhaps lower reproductive rates. Now, at about this time, I was just beginning my study of Tibetan macaques in China, and I saw this as a challenge. I originally went there to examine aspects of kinship and conflict management. And I was attracted to my study group because it was the only one for this species that was habituated to human observation and for which we knew maternal kinship relationships. But unfortunately, the group had been made into a tourist attraction a few years before. So my plan was to gather data on this group to start with and to begin habituating an undisturbed group for later comparison. And so this plan also provided me with an opportunity to evaluate the effects of tourist management on the behavior and the fitness of the monkeys. Now, as it turned out, I was not able to observe a second group, but I was able to collaborate with Dr. Hideshi Egawa, who you see on the right in the top panel, who observed the same group about 10 years before me. So by combining our data, we were able to look at long-term trends in behavior and fitness under a variety of management protocols. And indeed, our combined data constituted a natural experiment with a before, during, and after design. We had 18 years of data on infant mortality, 6 before management began, 11 years during management, and 1 year after management was temporarily suspended. We also had 5 years of aggression data from before and during management. Then, following my study, another research team led by Dr. Megan Matheson of Central Washington University, who you see as the second from the right there, began to examine the same problem, but in a different way. Instead of looking at long-term effects on aggression and infant mortality, they looked at immediate behavioral responses of the same monkeys to the tourists. So let me show you the study site. Our study site, Mount Huangshan, is a scenic area and popular tourist destination in east central China. It consists of steep, sparsely treed peaks at high elevations and mixed forest at middle and lower elevations. Millions of tourists climb staircases to the top of these mountains. Then they stay overnight in hotels and watch the sunrise, often from above the clouds. So it's a very nice experience. The Tibetan macaques live in forests in the middle elevations, where they've been protected from hunting and trapping since the 1940s. Like most macaques, they are primarily terrestrial, and they live in groups with several adult males and adult females and their offspring. The females are philopatric, that is, they remain in their natal groups for life and continue to associate with their kin, but the males disperse and join other groups as young adults. They also have strict linear dominance hierarchies that determine access to limited resources. Now, several Chinese researchers, including my counterpart, Dr. Jinhua Li, began to observe our study group in 1986, 6 years before management began. And to facilitate their observations, they provisioned the group with 6 kilograms of corn per day in an open area by a stream, but only during their observation periods. That is for 3 to 4 times per year, each time lasting 1 to 3 months. Now, this continued until 1992, when the local government relocated the group to an area adjacent to their natural range in preparation for tourism. Observation and provisioning continued much as before in a new area that was also by a stream and was virtually the same size as the previous provisioning area. But provisioning now occurred every day as the staff built a viewing pavilion. Now, as you can imagine, at first, the group frequently attempted to return to their natural range, but the staff prevented this by herding them back when they strayed too far. So they'd get behind the group, they would shout, they would throw stones and sticks, and in so doing, the group's intended range was reduced from nearly 8 square kilometers to less than 3 square kilometers. However, the group frequently managed to stray outside their intended range, so range restriction at this time could be considered inconsistent. Well, by 1994, the viewing pavilion was complete and tourism began. Tourists climbed this long staircase up a hill to the viewing pavilion, and the provisioning area is just on the other side of that pavilion, as you see here. Now, to ensure that the monkeys would show up at feeding time, the staff became more consistent about range restriction, but provisioning and data collection continued much as before. And this pattern of management continued all the way until 2002, when a new director further restricted its range to only about 1 square kilometer immediately surrounding the provisioning area. And this was in order to make the group continuously available to tourists. Then in 2003, operations were suspended due to the SARS epidemic, but they resumed later that year. Now, as for behavioral changes, the group, soon after the group was relocated, Dr. Lee noticed 2 major changes. First, he had the impression that rates of aggression increased, and here you see 2 monkeys fighting each other at the base of the viewing pavilion. Also, for the first time, Dr. Lee observed severe attacks on infants by adult males and infant corpses with bite wounds. So, based on these observations, my research team and I decided to first examine the general hypothesis that management for tourism was associated with high rates of aggression and infant mortality. And then to test several non-exclusive hypotheses aimed at identifying specific aspects of management that may have been most harmful to infants. So let's look at some results. This slide shows the percentage of infants that died before 1 year of age from 1986 to 2003. Now, as you can see, infant mortality was very low in the 6 years before management began, except in 1988, when a disease swept through the group and killed several infants in a single week. Infant mortality began to increase in 1992, the year that the group came under human management. And although mortality rates varied tremendously over the course of management from 92 to 2002, there were 2 peaks. One in 1994, when tourism and consistent range restriction began, and one in 2002, when the group's range was more severely restricted. Then it fell in 2003 after management was suspended. So when we grouped the data for individual infants that were born before, during, and after management, the differences were striking and statistically significant. Chances of mortality were significantly higher during management than before it, but they were similar before and after. Now, many of the infants that died during management were severely injured shortly before their deaths. This slide shows the number of infant deaths from wounding and other causes from 1999 to 2003, the years in which we had complete records. Overall, there were 24 infant deaths, of which 15, or 62.5%, were due to wounding. And this is in contrast to the pre-management period when no infant deaths were attributed to wounding. Now, unfortunately, our direct knowledge of the events leading up to most infant deaths is limited, but we have no reason to believe that they were caused by predation or intergroup aggression. No large predators were present in Huangshan, and the few encounters we saw between groups were limited to peering and non-aggressive calling. And we did witness a couple of direct attacks by adult males on infants. But in most cases, infants, like this one, appeared with wounds shortly after an outbreak of aggression among adults in the provisioning area. Typically, the fight moved into the forest where our visibility was limited. But shortly after the fight died down, the mother carried the injured or dead infant back into the provisioning area. So in these cases, we couldn't be sure which monkeys were killers or defenders of infants, or even whether infants were targeted in the forest. Nevertheless, there was a clear contextual link between infant mortality and adult aggression in the provisioning area that was not always initially directed at infants. And this link appeared when we examined variations in levels of aggression and infant mortality over time. We were able to pull together aggression data for adults in 6 time periods. The first period you see there is 10 weeks immediately preceding the group's relocation in 92. The next one, 10 weeks immediately after relocation. Then 7 to 9 months after relocation. Then finally in the fall and winter of 2000, the spring of 2001, and the spring and summer of 2002. We chose these periods not only because we used virtually identical behavioral categories and data collection methods, but also because dominance relationships among the adults within each period were stable. So this slide shows aggression rates between adult males and females, but the patterns were similar for other partner combinations. And as you can see, aggression in the provisioning area, shown in pink, began to increase after relocation, continued to increase when tourism and range restriction were in full swing in 2000 and 2001, and was particularly high in 2002 when the group's range was most severely restricted. In contrast, mean rates of aggression in the forest, shown in blue, were low during all time periods and didn't vary much over time. Now, unfortunately, we have no data on aggression from 2003, when management was suspended. So we don't know whether aggression actually decreased at this time. However, if you look at the years for which we do have data, you can see that there was a significant correlation between year-to-year fluctuations in infant mortality rates and total aggression between adults in the provisioning area. So, given these statistical and contextual links, we decided to next have an attempt to narrow down narrow aspects of management that may have been responsible. So we first examined possible direct effects of management. We looked at numbers of tourists and degree of range restriction. We reasoned that range restriction might be expected to affect competition within the group because it limits the monkey's ability to feed on dispersed natural food resources and increases their dependence on clumped monopolizable sources of provision food. Now note that we could not directly examine provisioning itself because it was done so consistently every year. The main difference was that the monkeys were provisioned less regularly before management, but during management, provisioning was very consistent, making it impossible to separate its effects from the overall effects of management itself. We next looked at demographic variables, reasoning that management might be expected to affect aggression and infant mortality indirectly through its effects on group composition. So we examined group size, we examined numbers of adults, and male to female sex ratios, since tourism appeared to reduce male immigration into the group. We also compared years with and without fissions or group splits, because these events can involve heightened aggression, and they became more frequent after management began. Then finally, we tested a prediction based on the sexual selection theory of infanticide. Basically, this theory suggests that male mammals, under certain circumstances, may benefit from killing unweaned infants that are not their own. It works when only a few high-ranking males in a group are able to father infants, and when a male's tenure in this lucky position is short. Under these circumstances, new alpha males may benefit by killing unweaned infants because this disrupts the mother's lactation and causes her to return quickly to fertility. And this in turn allows the new alpha male to begin reproducing months earlier than he would otherwise. So I asked whether infant mortality was greater in years in which there was a new alpha male than in years in which there wasn't any change. Well, to make a long story short, the only strong relationships we found were with degree of range restriction. In fact, range restriction accounted for more than 54% of the variation in infant mortality, and nearly all the variation in adult aggression in the provisioning area, although our sample size was quite small for this. So my research team was left with the conclusion that range restriction jeopardizes infants by raising levels of aggression in the provisioning area. And we suggest that range restriction may have done this in at least two ways. First, by increasing dependence on and competition over clumped sources of provisioned food. And second, the way range restriction was done here by herding may have been particularly stressful, leading to increased aggression. So now for the second set of studies by Dr. Matheson's group. Their approach was to examine the tourist group from 2004 to 2008, recording moment-to-moment behavioral responses of individual monkeys to tourists as a function of the levels of noise they made and the tourists' actual behavior toward the monkeys. So in addition to recording monkey aggression, they recorded how often the monkeys showed self-directed behaviors, including self-scratching, self-grooming, body shaking, and yawning. And they did this because these behaviors have been shown to be reliable indicators of stress hormone levels in a variety of primates and contexts. So their results suggested first that monkeys do indeed display higher levels of some stress indicators when there are many tourists present in the pavilion than when there are few. For example, here you see a positive relationship between rates of self-grooming and number of tourists in the pavilion. Second, the effects of tourist numbers on other stress indicators appeared to vary with the nearness of the monkeys to the viewing pavilion. Although they found no relationship between tourist numbers and self-directed behaviors in general, there was a positive relationship for the monkeys that were close to the pavilion. More specifically, in the only area that was surrounded by tourists on two sides rather than one. Third, they found a relationship between tourist noise and aggression rates. The monkeys showed higher rates of aggression when decibel levels in the pavilion were higher. Finally, rates of threatening by monkeys were higher when tourists directed more behaviors toward them. And when they examined sequences of behaviors between monkeys and humans, they found that the monkeys responded most consistently when humans pointed at them, slapped the rail, and got their attention, to get their attention, or displayed rocks in a threatening manner. So to conclude, the approaches of our two teams were complementary, and our results were largely congruent, providing a broad critique of the effects of tourism on the behavior and mortality of Tibetan macaques at Huangshan. First, tourism was strongly associated with high rates of infant mortality. Infant mortality was significantly higher during tourism management than either before or after. Second, most infant deaths were from wounds, and they appeared to be byproducts of high levels of aggression among adults within the provisioning area. Third, one aspect of tourism, range restriction, was strongly associated with both high infant mortality and aggression by adults. So we suggest that range restriction, which was done by herding, may have increased overall levels aggressive tendencies by increasing competition for food or by raising levels of fear-induced stress. Fourth, high tourist density also appeared to lead to increased stress, as evidenced by increased levels of self-directed behavior. And finally, there was evidence that tourist noise and specific human behaviors, such as pointing and rail slapping, triggered aggression in the short term. So I'd like to end with these acknowledgments, and by saying that while these results may lead some people to pessimism about the value of wildlife tourism, not to mention guilt about being a tourist, I hope the broad behavioral approach that our two research teams introduced is encouraging others not to abandon tourism, but rather to make it better. For the last decade or so, we've been urging other researchers to evaluate the behavioral effects at other sites in order to give managers a greater understanding of which specific aspects of tourism are productive and which are counterproductive to conservation goals. In this particular case, range restriction and herding are clearly inappropriate, and we recommend that rules about human behavior around the monkeys be better enforced. In other tourism operations, the problems might be different, so there's a great deal of work to be done. Thank you.